The air in Ephraim Harrison's office on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building smelled of three things: old linen bond paper, overpriced espresso, and the sharp, chemical tang of Garnet's sweat. "Look at me, you bitter little bitch." Garnet's voice didn't just ring. It grated against the soundproof triple-pane glass overlooking Lexington Avenue. Her manicured fingers, clutching a custom crocodile Birkin that my father's money had bought her 3 months before his heart finally gave out, were shaking. She lunged across the 4-inch thick mahogany desk, her silk blouse tearing slightly at the shoulder. She wanted the paper. The white sheet with the New York Sauget's court seal embossed on the bottom left corner. But Ephraim Harrison didn't let her touch it. The old man moved with the deliberate, glacial precision of a federal judge. He adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles, his eyes shifting from the document to the 2 New York State troopers standing by the heavy oak double doors. "Sit down, Mrs. Vance," Harrison said. His voice was a dry New England rasp. Cold. Devoid of the sycophantic warmth he usually reserved for people with 8-figure portfolios. "Or the officers will assist you." To her right, her son, my half-brother Barrett, looked like he was about to vomit on his velvet Tom Ford loafers. The swagger was gone. The arrogant tilt of his chin that he'd used to push me out of the family townhouse the night my father died had dissolved into a pale, greasy sheen of terror. The handcuffs hanging from the lead trooper's belt gave a dull, metallic clink as the officer shifted his weight. I didn't move. I sat in the low-backed leather chair in the corner, out of the direct sunlight, wearing a $70 black dress from a department store in Queens. My hands were folded in my lap. Still. No shaking. No sweating. When you spend 5 years as a senior forensic accountant auditing bankrupt shell companies in the dark corners of Delaware, you learn that anger is a waste of capital. You don't yell. You don't threaten. You just look at the numbers until they tell you where the throat is. "This is a mistake," Barrett stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. He looked at Harrison, then at the troopers, completely ignoring me. To them, I was still the invisible daughter from the first marriage. The one they'd successfully cut out of the loop while my father's brain was turning to mush from the early onset Alzheimer's. The Aegis Logistics asset was ours. The amendment specifically stated. The amendment you forced your dying stepfather to sign in a private hospice room while he was on 4 milligrams of liquid morphine. I asked. My voice was quiet. It cut through the room's frantic energy like a razor through lard. Garnet snapped her head toward me, her eyes bloodshot, veins pulsing at her temples. "You did this. You planted those files. You put that money in there to trap us." I let a long, slow pause fill the room. The silence stretched for 3, 4, 5 beats. "I didn't plant anything, Garnet," I said softly. "I merely added $4 million of my own liquid capital to my father's final testament. I specified it as a direct injection into Aegis Logistics, a company you and your son legally stripped from my father's estate 2 weeks ago." Harrison looked down at the paper again, then looked up at me. For 30 years, this man had handled the dirty laundry of Manhattan's elite. He had seen every variation of family malice, every backstabbing play executed by greedy heirs looking to bleed a patriarch dry before the body was even cold in the ground. He knew the city was built on these quiet white-collar massacres. But as he looked at me, I saw something shift behind his gray eyes. It wasn't just surprise. It was a cold, professional dawning of horror. An admiration. "The law is a blunt instrument, Mrs. Vance," Harrison said. His words directed at Garnet, but his eyes still locked on me. "But in the hands of someone who understands the Internal Revenue Code, it becomes a scalpel." He picked up a heavy Montblanc pen, not to sign, but to point at the clause highlighted in yellow ink. "When you filed the emergency injunction to seize Aegis Logistics from Maren last Tuesday," Harrison explained, his tone conversational, almost brutal in its calm, "you swore under penalty of perjury that you assumed all corporate assets, all outstanding warrants, and all historical liabilities associated with that specific entity. You wanted the $4 million Maren left behind. You thought it was a parting gift from an old man who didn't know what day it was." Barrett took a step toward the desk, but the larger of the 2 troopers placed a gloved hand on his shoulder. The kid froze. "It was $4 million, Barrett whispered, looking at his mother. "It was sitting in the corporate escrow. We checked the routing numbers. It was clear cash." "It was clear," I agreed. leaning forward slightly so the midday sun hit the edge of my jaw. Every cent of that $4 million came from my personal advisory fees. Clean audited, tax-paid money. But what you didn't check, Barrett, because you were too busy popping champagne in the back of a Maybach, was the legal origin of the Aegis corporate charter. People watch television and they think revenge stories are about shouting matches, broken glass, and dramatic slaps in the face. They think it's about tears. But real power in America doesn't yell. It operates under Title 26 of the United States Code. It moves through the automated systems of the Internal Revenue Service at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. 5 years ago, I said, looking directly into Garnet's eyes, watching the exact second the realization began to burrow into her brain. You used Aegis to move $12 million out of my father's shipping accounts into an offshore trust in Antigua. You thought he'd never remember. You thought the paper trail was buried under 3 layers of dissolved LLCs. I stood up. The movement was fluid, effortless. I didn't look like a victim anymore. I looked like the only person in the room who knew where the fire exits were. The moment you signed the quitclaim deed to strip that company from me to get your hands on my $4 million, I whispered. You legally stepped into my father's shoes as the sole responsible officer for Aegis's historical tax fraud. The $4 million triggered an automatic IRS audit for sudden capital influx. And I filed the whistleblower report 6 hours ago. Harrison let out a breath through his nose, a sound that was almost a laugh, if he weren't a man who charged $900 an hour to keep people out of federal penitentiaries. He didn't look at Garnet. He didn't look at the trembling Barrett. Slowly, the old lawyer stood up from his leather executive chair. He didn't smooth his tie. He didn't reach for his briefcase. Instead, he turned his entire body toward me, placed his palms flat against his thighs and bowed. A deep, deliberate 90-degree tilt from the waist. The kind of bow an old-world courtier gives to a monarch who has just cleared the board. The estate is settled, Harrison said into the quiet of the room. May God have mercy on your soul, Maren. Before there was a $4 million trap, there was a 4th-floor window at Mount Sinai Hospital. The rain in New York during late November doesn't just fall. It bleeds into the gray limestone, turning the city into a cold, slick vault. I stood across Fifth Avenue, my back pressed against the wet stone wall of Central Park, my boots soaking through. Up there, behind the double-paned glass of room 412, my father was dying. And I was legally dead to him. Arthur Vance had been a giant. He built Vance Marine Group from a single rotting pier in Brooklyn into a multi-million-dollar logistics empire that moved freight across 3 oceans. He was a man who memorized shipping manifests by sight. But by that winter, the plaques in his brain had eaten his vocabulary. The giant had been reduced to a 90-pound shell who couldn't remember the name of his first wife, my mother, or why he had spent 30 years building an empire. Garnet had seen the diagnosis not as a tragedy, but as a corporate restructuring opportunity. She had been his executive assistant before she became his second wife. She knew the layout of his accounts better than his lawyers did. The moment the word Alzheimer's appeared on a neurological report from Columbia Presbyterian, Garnet moved with surgical silence. She didn't file for a public conservatorship. That would draw the eyes of Wall Street analysts and depress the company's stock. Instead, she systematically replaced his personal security, his medical staff, and his private chefs with people who answered only to her payroll. I was cut off within 48 hours. My security badge at the Vance Marine headquarters was deactivated. My calls to my father's personal cell phone were routed to a disconnected Google Voice number. When I showed up at the family townhouse on 74th Street, 2 off-duty NYPD officers hired as private estate security stood on the limestone steps, their hands resting casually on their utility belts. Orders from Mrs. Vance, Miss Maren, one of them told me, looking at the sidewalk rather than my eyes. You're not on the visitor log. So I watched from the park. I watched the Blacktown cars arrive and leave. I watched Garnet step out under the hospital awning, draped in a full-length sable coat that cost more than my annual salary as a forensic auditor. And then came the day she finally acknowledged my existence. Not out of mercy, out of spite. It happened at a small, sterile Italian cafe 2 blocks from the hospital. Garnet sat in a corner booth, her posture perfect, her face unlined by grief. She didn't offer me a seat. She didn't buy me a coffee. She simply waited until I stood by the table, dripping wet, before she reached into her leather tote and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder. She dropped it onto the marble tabletop. The sound was a heavy, wet thud. Your father's private medical care is running approximately $42,000 a week above what the insurance covers, Garnet said. Her voice had the dry, rhythmic cadence of a poker dealer. The experimental therapeutics from Switzerland. The around-the-clock private nursing. The penthouse suite on the VIP floor. I looked down at the folder. The Vance estate has a liquid cash reserve of $9 million. Why are you showing this to me? Because those reserves are currently locked in a corporate trust for the next fiscal quarter, she lied, her eyes narrowing slightly. And as his daughter, you have a moral obligation to contribute. This is a bill for $84,000. For the last 2 weeks. I expect a certified check by Friday. I didn't touch the folder. You've frozen his personal accounts, haven't you? You and Barrett. Garnet smiled. It was a thin, terrible movement of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. Barrett has been appointed the interim managing partner of Vance Marine. Your father signed the durable power of attorney last month. It's entirely legal, Maren. Harrison reviewed it himself. My father couldn't remember his own social security number last month, Garnet? I said, my voice dropping an octave, tight with a rage that felt like iron in my throat. He didn't sign anything willingly. A court would disagree, she whispered, leaning forward. The scent of her Chanel No. 5 mixed with the sour aroma of the espresso. The signature is notarized. He was having a lucid day. He wants his family taken care of. His real family. Not the daughter who chose to spend her life digging through other people's garbage in Queens. She reached out, her sharp French-tipped fingernail tapping the manila folder. Pay the bill, Maren. Or I tell the medical board that you refuse to fund his palliative care. Let's see how that looks when we go to probate. That was the moment I realized they weren't just stealing his money. They wanted to humiliate me until there was nothing left. They wanted me to bleed my own meager savings dry to pay for a room they wouldn't let me enter. 3 days later my father died. They didn't call me. I found out from a Bloomberg terminal alert at my desk in Queens. Arthur Vance, shipping magnate, dies at 68. The funeral at St. Bartholomew's Church on Park Avenue was less a memorial and more a corporate marketing campaign. The steps were lined with paparazzi. The pews were filled with senators, hedge fund managers, and city officials. Garnet wore a black veil that perfectly framed her calculated tears for the cameras. Barrett stood beside her, wearing a 3-piece charcoal suit, looking every bit the young heir apparent. I sat in the very last row, near the heavy bronze exit doors, ignored by the ushers. When the service ended and the crowd began to filter out toward the waiting limousines, I walked down the center aisle. I wanted 5 seconds alone with the casket. Just 5 seconds to say goodbye to the man who used to carry me on his shoulders through the Brooklyn shipyards. I didn't get 3. Barrett caught me by the elbow before I reached the chancel steps. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into my triceps through the thin fabric of my department store coat. 2 large men in dark suits stepped up behind him, blocking the view of the remaining guests. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here, Barrett muttered, his breath smelling of the peppermint lozenges he used to hide his morning scotch. He was my father, Barrett, I said, not pulling away, staring directly into his pale, watery eyes. Let go of my arm. He was a name on a checkbook that you didn't earn, he hissed. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for me. Listen to me carefully, Maren. The townhouse is being packed up tomorrow. Your mother's old things? The piano? The books? They're going into a dumpster on 74th Street. If I see your face near the property, I'll have the precinct captain handle you for criminal trespass. You're a stray dog in this city now. Act like it. He gave my arm a sharp twist before letting go, pushing me slightly toward the side exit. The 2 security guards moved in unison, forming a human wall that forced me toward the cold air of Park Avenue. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene for the photographers outside. I walked down the stone steps into the wind, my heels clicking rhythmically against the concrete. My eyes were dry. The grief had burned out somewhere between the hospital cafe and the church altar, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. I went back to my apartment in Astoria. It was a 500-square-foot walk-up above a bakery that smelled of grease and old yeast. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat at my laminate kitchen table, opened my old Dell laptop, and connected to the New York Department of State's corporate registry database. Barrett thought I was a stray dog. He forgot that a forensic auditor doesn't look at faces. We look at the digital ink. We look at the bones of the architecture. For 72 straight hours, I lived on black coffee and stale bread. My eyes burned from the blue light of the screen as I pulled every public filing, every U1 financing statement, and every corporate charter associated with Vance Marine Group over the last decade. Garnett and Barrett had been thorough. They had swept the primary accounts clean, moving the real estate holdings into an offshore entity called Vance Global Holdings, based in the Cayman Islands. They had left the main corporation as a hollowed-out shell, ready to be liquidated the moment the probate court finalized the will. But greed makes people lazy, and ultimate greed makes them blind. On the third night at 4:15 a.m. I found it. A tiny dormant entity registered in 2021 under the name Aegis Logistics LLC. The registration had my father's old signature on. Back when his hand was steady, it had been used exactly twice. Once to purchase a small, dilapidated warehouse near the Red Hook terminal, and once to receive a $12 million wire transfer from an account listed in Antigua. 3 days after that wire arrived, the $12 million had vanished, moved into a private trust under Garnett's maiden name. It was a textbook corporate bypass. They had used Aegis as a bucket to scoop money out of my father's main business, wash it through the Caribbean, and dump it into Garnett's lap. Then they had abandoned the bucket. The corporate registration was still active, but the tax filings had been marked insolvent for 3 years. They thought the paper trail was dead because my father's memory was dead. They didn't realize that in the state of New York, an insolvent corporation with unresolved foreign transactions remains a legal attachment to the estate of the primary signer until probate is closed. I leaned back in my chair, the plastic creaking in the quiet apartment. They wanted the Vance empire. They wanted every cent, every brick, every pier. They were willing to commit forgery, elder abuse, and perjury to secure it. They thought they had one. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. Tomorrow I would call Ephraim Harrison. I wouldn't ask for a piece of the inheritance. I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would give them the company. But first, I was going to make it look like the most valuable thing they had ever stolen. Ephraim Harrison's private conference room didn't have the sweeping floor-to-ceiling view of Lexington Avenue that his main office boasted. This room was tucked away in the quiet back corner of the suite, lined with heavy leather-bound volumes of the New York appellate reports. It smelled of lemon wax, old linen paper, and the stale, bitter dregs of mid-afternoon coffee. "This is financial suicide, Maren," Harrison said. He wasn't bowing now. He was holding a 3-page printout of my personal bank statements. 3 separate accounts, completely liquidated into a single, official cashier's check drawn from Chase Manhattan. The number on the face of the check was exact: $4,012,411. My entire life. My mother's small life insurance policy, my 5 years of grinding 80-hour weeks as a senior forensic auditor for Wall Street firms, my blood. "It's a codicil, Ephraim," I said. I sat straight in the high-back chair, my wool coat still damp from the Queens Transit platform. "I want it executed under New York Estates Powers and Trusts Law, Section 1 to 2.1, a clean, irrevocable amendment to my father's will. No ambiguities. You are injecting $4 million of your own liquid cash into a dead, insolvent shell company," Harrison said. His voice was a flat, rhythmic rasp, completely devoid of empathy. He was an expensive machine that processed multi-generational wealth. He didn't care about feelings, but he hated seeing a bad trade. And then you are leaving that specific entity to yourself in the testament. If your stepmother's lawyers get wind of this, they will contest the entire estate just to tie up your $4 million in Saget's court for the next 7 years. You'll be broke before you ever see a dime. "She won't contest it," I said, leaning over his glass desk until I could see the reflection of my own bloodshot eyes. "She'll try to rob it." Harrison paused. His long liver-spotted fingers tapped the edge of the cashier's check. He knew Garnett. He had drafted the prenuptial agreement she had systematically dismantled, while my father was losing his ability to read his own watch. He knew the absolute depths of her appetite. Explain, he murmured. The codicil must state that Aegis Logistics LLC is left exclusively to me, along with any cash balances held in its corporate escrow at the hour of death, I explained. I've already initiated the wire. It's sitting in the Aegis corporate account right now. It shows up on the estate balance sheet as an unallocated capital contribution. Nothing more. And you think they won't notice a $4 million spike on a company that hasn't moved a shipping container since 2021? Oh, they'll notice, I said, a cold, dry smile pulling at the corners of my mouth. I'm going to make sure they do. The trap required more than legal filings. It required psychological leverage. 2 hours later, back in my Astoria walk-up, with the elevated N train rumbling outside and shaking the old plaster walls every 12 minutes, I went to work. I didn't hire hackers. I didn't use the dark web. I used what I knew about Barrett's specific brand of vanity-driven stupidity. Barrett had a Google Workspace alert set up on the Vance Marine corporate server. He had programmed it to flag any external email containing the words valuation, buyout, acquisition, or offshore. He wanted to make sure no one was making a deal behind his back. He was a classic insecure despot, terrified that his mother's schemes would leave him out in the cold. I bought a domain name through a registrar based in Iceland, cross-Atlantic-maritime UK. I paid $64 for it. Then I set up an old-fashioned IMAP mail server and drafted a document. I addressed the email to my father's old unmonitored personal inbox, the one Barrett had cloned onto his own iPad weeks ago. The subject line was simple: confidential. Restructuring and asset purchase offer, Aegis Logistics, New York Charter number 88412. The text looked like it had been forwarded 3 times through a magic circle law firm in London. I used the dry, passive-aggressive language of British corporate raiders. The text detailed an urgent, highly time-sensitive offer to purchase Aegis Logistics for $22 million. Why? Because according to my attached digital document, Aegis held a grandfathered, non-transferable Jones Act maritime exemption from 1984. In the shipping industry, a Jones Act exemption is holy water. It allows a foreign-built vessel to move cargo between domestic U.S. ports without paying federal tariffs. My father had actually owned one in the 90s, but it had expired in 2004. I merely altered the digital expiration date on an old PDF copy of the Federal Registry and attached it to the email. To a real maritime lawyer, the trick would have lasted 10 minutes. To Barrett, a boy who thought corporate strategy meant buying a faster sports car, it was a goldmine. I knew how greedy heirs operated. They don't do the due diligence. They don't hire independent auditors because they're terrified the auditors will find their own thefts. They look at the numbers, they see a shortcut to another million, and they jump. The server logs didn't lie. By 2 p.m. on Thursday, 3 days before the formal probate hearing, the Iceland server recorded 5 separate downloads of the attached PDF from an IP address registered to the Vance Marine Executive Suite on Park Avenue. Barrett had bitten hard. I could practically see him pacing the plush wool carpets of my father's old office, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind calculating how many zero-interest loans he could draw against a $22 million asset. But there was a beautiful, agonizing problem that I had manufactured for him. The email stated the offer would expire the exact moment my father's estate entered formal probate. If Aegis Logistics went to me under the original terms of the will, I would become the sole owner of the company, the $4 million in cash sitting in its escrow, and the mythical $22 million London buyout. That night I sat on my fire escape, listening to the sirens down on the Grand Central Parkway. The air was crisp, smelling of winter asphalt. My phone vibrated. It was an encrypted number. "They just called me." Harrison's voice came through the speaker. He sounded tired, but there was an edge to his tone now. A sharp professional focus. "Barrett and his mother. They've been in my office for 2 hours." "What did they say?" "They want to see the codicil. They found out about the $4 million transfer into the Aegis escrow account. Barrett has a mole in the compliance department at Chase who flagged the incoming wire." "Good," I said, watching an oil tanker crawl down the East River in the distance. "Did you show them the amendment?" "I showed them exactly what you told me to show them," Harrison said. A long pause. I could hear the rustle of heavy bond paper on his end. "They're frantic, Maren. Garnet is convinced your father was trying to hide money from her before his mind went completely dark. She thinks the $4 million was his secret stash, moved from an old account in Switzerland to protect you from the restructuring. Let her think that. They're preparing an emergency restructuring agreement, Harrison warned. They're going to present it to you at the reading on Monday morning. They aren't going to contest the will, Maren. They're going to try to force you into a swap. They want Aegis. They want the $4 million. They want the whole board. They'll offer me a settlement, I murmured. A small, insulting amount of cash to sign over the corporate shares. $50,000, Harrison confirmed. That's the figure Barrett threw out. He said it's more than enough for a girl from Queens. I closed my eyes. I felt the cold iron of the fire escape rail against my bare palms. Most revenge stories end in a noisy courtroom with a judge pounding a gavel, or in a dark alley with a weapon. But those are sloppy. They leave a mess. They leave room for appeals. They leave room for expensive defense lawyer to find a technicality. The only real way to destroy people like Garnet and Barrett is to let them build their own gallows. You don't push them. You just paint the trap to look like a chest of gold and leave the keys in the lock. Let them bring the paperwork, Ephraim, I said quietly into the phone. Tell them I'm devastated. Tell them I'm broke and desperate. Make sure Barrett thinks he's the smartest man in Manhattan. And the $4 million? Harrison asked. His voice had dropped to a whisper now. The old corporate lawyer was finally seeing the entire grid. You're leaving it in. The escrow? If they sign, that money legally belongs to the corporation. If your logic fails, Maren, you lose everything. My logic doesn't fail, Ephraim, I said. Greed has an exact mathematical weight. I've calculated theirs down to the penny. I hung up. I went back inside, closed the laptop, and laid down on my narrow bed. For the first time in 6 months, since the day they locked me out of the hospital room, I didn't feel the chill of the November air. The bait was in the water. The line was taut. All that was left was to let the vultures pull until the hook tore through. The steam radiator in the corner of Ephraim Harrison's private library didn't just hiss. It clanked like a dying engine, a rhythmic metallic thud that timed the heartbeat of everyone in the room. Monday morning, 10:15. Outside, the December sleet was turning the Manhattan skyline into a blurred slate of gray. Garnet arrived first. She wore a tailored charcoal wool suit with an asymmetrical collar, the kind of high-fashion armor that said morning but whispered boardroom. Her knuckles were white where her fingers wrapped around the strap of her handbag, but her face was cast in marble. Behind her, Barrett smelled of expensive sandalwood cologne and nervous sweat. He kept adjusting his French cuffs, his eyes darting toward the leather briefcase resting on Harrison's mahogany side table. I was already seated. The same low-back chair. The same cheap black dress. I had a small plastic-bound notebook from a corner bodega open on my knee, a yellow stub of a pencil balanced between my fingers. I looked like an inconvenience, a legal afterthought. Let's get this over with, Ephraim, Garnet said, her voice dropping into the quiet room like a lead weight. She didn't look at me. She treated the space I occupied as empty air. We have an 11:30 restructuring meeting with the institutional investors at Park Avenue. We don't have time for a grand production. Harrison didn't look up from his desk. He was organizing 3 identical blue-backed folders with the slow, maddening deliberation of a man who billed by the minute. The law requires a formal reading when a codicil has been filed within 30 days of the decedent's passing, Mrs. Vance, Harrison said softly. He unscrewed the cap of his fountain pen. The scratch of the gold nib against the first page of the file was the only sound for 5 seconds. We proceed in order. He began to read. The standard boilerplate of New York probate. Arthur Vance being of sound mind and memory. It was a farce. We all knew it. The document Harrison was reading from was the primary will Garnet had engineered. The one that left the townhouse, the global holdings, and the liquid cash reserves to her and Barrett. Every time Harrison read a clause that stripped another layer of my father's life away from me, Barrett's chin tilted up a fraction of an inch. His confidence was returning. He thought the heavy lifting was done. Then Harrison turned to page 14. The beige paper gave a crisp, heavy rustle. We come to the codicil executed on November 24th, Harrison announced, his voice flattening into a strictly professional drone. Regarding the entity known as Aegis Logistics LLC, New York Corporate Charter Number 88412. I moved. It was a small movement, but in that silent room it was a lightning strike. I pulled my cheap purse closer to my chest, letting the plastic zipper give a sharp metallic click. I leaned forward, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the vinyl strap. I let out a short, shallow breath, the kind of ragged gasp a person makes when they think their last lifeline is about to be cut. Barrett's head snapped toward me. His pale blue eyes locked onto my hands. He saw the tension. He saw the fear. He smiled. The decedent directs, Harrison read, that any and all outstanding shares, corporate assets, and unallocated cash balances currently held within the corporate escrow account of Aegis Logistics LLC at the time of his passing shall be bequeathed solely and without encumbrance to his daughter Maren Vance. Thank God, I whispered. I made sure it was audible. I let my shoulder drop, letting the pencil slip from my fingers and roll across the hardwood floor until it bumped against Barrett's leather shoe. I leaned back, closing my eyes, exhaling a long, trembling breath of pure, unadulterated relief. Barrett didn't kick the pencil away. He looked up at his mother. A sharp, feral look passed between them. It was the exact expression a wolf gives another wolf when the deer steps into the clearing. He knew about the $4 million. He knew about the fake $22 million London buyout offer sitting on his iPad. He thought I had just realized I was rich and he wasn't about to let that happen. Hold on, Barrett said. He stood up, his leather chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. Ephraim, stop right there. Harrison paused, his pen hovering an inch above the text. Is there an issue, Mr. Vance? There's a massive issue, Barrett hissed, stepping toward the desk. He pulled a fresh, stapled document from his inner jacket pocket and slammed it down over Harrison's blue folders. Aegis Logistics isn't a separate entity. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of Vance Marine Group. My father didn't have the legal authority to alienate corporate infrastructure through a personal codicil. That $4 million in the escrow belongs to the shareholders. It belongs to us. The corporate registry lists Arthur Vance as the sole proprietor and sole guarantor of the Aegis Charter. Barrett, Harrison said, his voice flat, completely unbothered by the outburst. Under New York law, he had the right to dispose of the entity as he saw fit. We'll tie it up in court for 10 years, Garnet broke in. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the icy, venomous precision of a woman who had spent 2 decades watching men destroy each other for money. She leaned forward, her diamond tennis bracelet clinking sharply against Harrison's glass desk topper. She looked at me now. Her eyes were 2 slits of cold green stone. Maren doesn't have 10 years. She doesn't have the capital to pay a retainer for 10 days. She reached into her handbag and pulled out 2 things. A certified cashier's check from Bank of America and a single-page document with the words quitclaim deed and corporate release printed across the top in bold, black Helvetica. She slid them across the mahogany desk toward me. They stopped 3 inches from my hand. $50,000, Garnet said. Right there. Clean cash. You sign the quitclaim, you surrender any and all claims to Aegis Logistics, its assets, and its escrow accounts, and you walk out of here with enough money to pay your rent in Queens for the next 3 years. If you don't. She paused, letting the radiator hiss fill the void. I will personally file an emergency injunction before the surrogate judge closes his ledger today. I will freeze that escrow. I will audit your personal taxes. I will make sure you spend the next decade of your life drowning in legal debt. Look down at the check. $50,000. A joke. A crumb thrown to a beggar. I looked at Barrett. He was leaning against the bookshelf, his arms folded over his chest, his mouth twisted into a smug, triumphant smirk. He thought he was John Rockefeller. He thought he had just used his corporate leverage to strip a $22 million asset away from his sister for pennies on the dollar. Please, I said. My voice was trembling now. I let my eyes well up with a thin glaze of tears. I hated myself for the performance, but the stage was set and the marks were in position. The $4 million. That was my father's money. He put it there for me. He wanted me to have a future. Your father was a senile old man who didn't know what he was doing, Barrett barked, stepping closer, his shadow falling completely over my chair. You take the 50 grand, Maren, or you get nothing. Sign the paper. Ephraim, I pleaded, turning to Harrison, my hands shaking as I reached for the edge of his desk. Can they do this? Is this legal? Harrison looked at me. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but I saw the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. He knew what was on the other side of that paper. He knew what they were doing. If they file the injunction, Maren, Harrison said carefully, choosing his words with extreme precision, the court will be forced to examine the entire corporate structure of Aegis. The litigation will be extensive. It will involve a full forensic review of all historical transactions associated with that charter. If you cannot afford representation, the assets will remain frozen indefinitely. Hear that? Barrett sneered, tossing an expensive Montblanc pen onto the desk so it landed right on top of the quitclaim deed. Extensive. That means you lose, sis. Sign the deed. Take the check and go back to your spreadsheets. I let out a small pathetic sob. Picked up the pen. My fingers were shaking so violently I almost dropped it twice. This isn't fair, I whispered, looking down at the line that read grantor's signature. He was my father too. Life isn't fair, darling, Garnet said, her voice dripping with an artificial, mocking sweetness as she leaned back into her furs. Now put your name on the line so we can go to our real meeting. I pressed the gold nib of the pen to the paper. I hesitated for one last, agonizing second, letting Barrett lean in closer, his breath hot against my cheek as he watched the ink hit the page. I signed. Maren Vance. The moment the final loop of the was finished, Barrett snatched the paper off the desk before the ink could even dry. He held it up to the gray light of the window, checking the signature with a greedy, frantic intensity. It's done, Barrett whispered to his mother, his face breaking into a wide, ugly grin. We own the charter. We own the escrow. The company is ours. Good, Garnet said, rising from her chair with the fluid elegance of a victor. Ephraim, file the corporate transfer immediately. The estate is settled. I sat back in my chair, my hands falling limp into my lap. The tears were gone. The trembling had stopped. The radiator gave one last, loud clank in the corner, and in the sudden silence that followed, I looked at the clock on the wall. 10:26 a.m. The line had been cast. The hook was set deep in their throats, and the tide was about to turn. Barrett was still blowing on the ink, his breath warm and foul in the small gap between us. He folded the quitclaim deed with a crisp, triumphant snap, shoving it into his breast pocket right over his heart. Let's go, mother, he said. He didn't look at me. The car's idling on 43rd. Garnet picked up her gloves. Her fingers were long, smooth, and entirely uncalloused. She rose, her mink coat shifting with a heavy, expensive rustle. She looked down at me once, a brief, dismissive glance reserved for a piece of cracked linoleum. Take the 50,000, Maren, she said, her voice dropping into that smooth, finishing school register. And don't buy anything you can't afford to maintain. I didn't reach for the check. It sat there on the dark mahogany, a small rectangle of green and white security paper, 3 inches from my sleeve. Instead, I reached into my vinyl purse. My fingers didn't shake now. The tremor was gone because the performance was over. I pulled out a heavy standard-issue white courier envelope. It didn't have Harrison's fancy engraving on it. It had a flat black return address stamped in the upper left corner. Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division, World Trade Center, New York, New York. I dropped it on the desk. The heavy paper made a dull, dry slap against the wood. You should stay for 5 minutes, Garnet, I said. My voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It had the flat, chilling clarity of a court reporter reading back an execution order. Barrett stopped 3 inches from the heavy oak door. His hand was on the brass lever. He turned slowly, his brow furrowing, his mouth opening slightly to let out another arrogant bark, but the look on my face stopped him. The tears were gone. My eyes were wide, clear, and perfectly focused on the bridge of his nose. What is that? Garnet asked. She didn't look at the envelope. She looked at my posture. I had stood up. I wasn't slouching. I didn't look like the girl from Queens who couldn't pay her electric bill. That is a certified copy of Form 211, I said, leaning my palms against the edge of Harrison's desk. An official application for award for information on original missing taxes. Filed with the whistleblower office in Washington at precisely 6:30 this morning. Harrison didn't move. His fountain pen remained poised over his ledger, a tiny drop of dark blue ink forming on the gold tip. His gray eyes shifted from the white envelope to me, then to the paper in Barrett's pocket. "Maren," Harrison warned, his rasp lower now dangerous, "if you filed an unauthorized disclosure while this estate is under probate." "It's entirely authorized, Ephraim." I cut him off, not looking at him. "Because as of 60 seconds ago, Aegis Logistics LLC is no longer part of my father's estate. Barrett just took it. He fought for it. He threatened me for it. And he signed the transfer." I looked at Barrett. The smugness was beginning to curdle on his face. A tiny dot of sweat had broken through his foundation, right at the corner of his left eyebrow. "You think you bought a Jones Act exemption for $22 million, Barrett?" I said, my words coming out in short rhythmic bursts. "You didn't. You bought a corpse. And you just agreed to dig it up. The London offer." Barrett stammered, his hand falling away from the door handle. "The email. We checked the domain. It was registered to Cross-Atlantic." "It was registered to me," I said, "through an automated proxy in Reykjavik. Cost me $64. The Jones Act PDF was a scan from a 1994 Federal Register I pulled from the public archives at the Standard Law Library in Brooklyn. I spent 3 hours with a trial version of Adobe Acrobat, altering the expiration dates." "You lied," Garnet hissed. Step by step, her regal composure was slipping. Her shoulders went rigid under the mink. "That's fraud. We'll have you indicted by the district attorney before sunset." "It's not fraud to send an email to a dead man's inbox, Garnet," I replied, my voice steady, cold, unhurried. "I didn't present that offer to you. I didn't put it on this desk. You hacked my father's server. You stole that data. You used stolen, unverified corporate intelligence to extort a legal settlement from me. Go ahead. Call the DA. Tell them you were trying to front-run an asset acquisition based on emails you illegally intercepted." Silence fell over the room again, thicker this time. The radiator gave a solitary metallic ping and then went quiet. "The $4 million, Barrett whispered. His voice was cracked now, the bravado completely gone. "The cash in the Chase escrow. That's real. We verified the routing number. The money is there." "The money is absolutely real," I said. "Every single dollar. It's my entire net worth. And it's currently sitting in the primary account of Aegis Logistics. But here's the problem with $4 million in cash, Barrett. The IRS has an automated transaction tracking system called the Currency Transaction Report Network. When an inactive, insolvent shell company that has reported zero revenue and 3 consecutive years of net losses suddenly receives an unsolicited wire transfer of $4 million from a personal account, it doesn't just trigger an alert. It sets off a Tier 1 red flag for sudden capital influx. I stepped around the chair, moving toward them. They didn't back up, but their bodies went tense, like passengers on a plane entering severe turbulence. "The IRS automated system instantly locks the account for review," I continued, my heels clicking against the oak floorboards. "Which means your $4 million, my $4 million, is currently frozen under a federal administrative hold. It cannot be moved. It cannot be borrowed against. It cannot be used to pay your institutional investors at 11:30. So what?" Barrett snapped, his chest heaving under his Tom Ford vest. "So we hire a tax attorney. We clear the hold. It's clear money. You said so yourself. The money is clean, Barrett. But the company isn't." I turned back to the desk, picking up the blue envelope and sliding the documents out. I held them up so Harrison could see the official watermark. "Let's talk about Title 26 of the United States Code, Section 6901, Transferee Liability." Harrison's head snapped up. His eyes widened behind his gold spectacles. He knew the statute. He knew exactly what it meant. "Under Section 6901, I said, my voice dropping into a harsh rhythmic cadence, "if you acquire the assets of an entity through a quitclaim or a voluntary transfer to extract its cash, you don't just take the money. You legally assume the position of the transferor. You inherit their sins. You inherit their historical liabilities, personally, jointly and severally. I walked over to Garnet, stopping until I could smell the heavy, cloying sweetness of her Chanel No. 5. In 2021, I whispered, staring straight into her widened pupils, you used Aegis Logistics to wash $12 million out of my father's commercial accounts into an offshore shell company called Lariat Holdings in Antigua. You thought the paper trail was cold because Arthur forgot the password to the account. But the IRS doesn't forget. The moment my $4 million triggered that automated audit this morning, the system pulled the historical wire logs for Aegis going back 5 years. Barrett looked at his mother. Mother? What is she talking about? Garnet didn't answer him. Her mouth was slightly open, her breath coming in short, shallow puffs that rattled in her throat. The color had left her skin, leaving her looking old, gray, and brittle under the expensive lighting of the library. The whistleblower report I filed at 6:30 includes the full routing maps for that $12 million, I said, looking back at Barrett. The original bank tokens, the corporate resolutions with your forged signatures on them, and the specific tax avoidance codes you used. Because you signed that quitclaim deed to take Aegis from me 60 seconds ago, you didn't just take my $4 million. You legally swore under penalty of perjury that you are the sole responsible officers for Aegis's past financial activities. I reached out, took the $50,000 check off Harrison's desk, and dropped it into Barrett's jacket pocket, right next to the stolen deed. The IRS doesn't just want the $12 million back, Barrett, I said softly. With fraud penalties, interest compounding over 4 years, and failure to disclose assessments under the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, the total bill comes out to exactly $15,412,000. And because you signed that paper, you are now personally liable for every single cent. Barrett stared at me, his eyes bloodshot, his face glistening with a thick layer of oily sweat. He reached into his pocket, his hand shaking so violently, he tore his own silk lining as he tried to pull the quitclaim deed back out. Take it back, he croaked, holding the white sheet toward me like it was covered in acid. Take it back, Maren. We don't want it. The agreement is void. Ephraim, tell her the agreement is void. Harrison didn't look at Barrett. He didn't look at the paper. Slowly, the old lawyer laid his Montblanc pen down on his desk. He reached up, took off his gold-rimmed glasses, and let out a long, slow breath that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. He looked at me, and for the first time in the 30 years he had known my family, his face wasn't a mask. It was a mirror of absolute, unmitigated ruin for the people standing next to me. The heavy oak doors didn't crash open. This wasn't Hollywood. Instead, the brass latch clicked with a quiet, terrifying authority, and the door swung wide to reveal 3 men in dark, unbranded windbreakers. 2 New York State troopers stepped inside first, their boots squeaking against the polished parquet. Between them stood a man with a leather clip-on badge resting against a charcoal tie. Special Agent Miller. IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Barrett Vance, Miller said. His voice was entirely flat, the sound of an automated machine reading a zip code. Garnet Vance. I have a federal warrant for your arrest, signed by Judge Kaplan of the Southern District of New York. Barrett let out a sound. It wasn't a scream, it was a high, thin wheeze, like air escaping a punctured tire. He stumbled backward, his hand frantically clawing at his breast pocket, trying to pull out the quitclaim deed I had just signed. He dropped it. The white paper fluttered through the air and landed right in the center of a patch of melting gray sleet that had dripped from his own loafers. Take it back, Barrett choked out, his knees visibly shaking against the edge of the mahogany table. He looked at me, his face a wet, greasy smear of terror. Maren, please. It's a mistake. We didn't know. We don't want the company. Ephraim, tell them. We rescind the execution. Ephraim Harrison didn't look up. He sat behind his desk, his hands flat against his blotter, his face pale and completely still. He knew the law. He knew that under the New York Corporate Code, the second that ink dried and the document was delivered across the desk, the transfer was legally absolute. There was no delete key. There was no do-over. Step away from the desk, sir, the lead trooper said. He didn't wait for Barrett to comply. He stepped forward, caught Barrett by the shoulder with a heavy, gloved hand and spun him around. The sharp, double click of the Smith & Wesson handcuffs locking around Barrett's wrists was loud, definite. It was the sound of a gate slamming shut. Garnet didn't make a sound. She stood frozen, her French-tipped fingers frozen in the air near her throat. Then her knees simply gave out. She didn't fall gracefully. She went down hard, her hip striking the side of Harrison's mahogany chair before she hit the floor. The custom crocodile Birkin bag slipped from her arm, tumbling sideways. A gold-plated compact, 3 bottles of prescription anti-anxiety medication, and a stack of crisp $100 bills spilled out across the floorboards, mingling with the dirty water from the street. Her mink coat bunched up around her neck like a dead animal. "Get up, ma'am," the second trooper said, leaning down to take her by the elbow. Garnet looked up at me through the tangled strands of her expensive blonde highlights. The sophisticated, untouchable matriarch of Park Avenue was gone. In her place was a terrified 50-year-old woman whose makeup was beginning to run in thick black lines down her cheeks. "You planned this," she whispered, her voice cracking, raw with a hatred that could have burned through the floorboards. "You stayed in that filthy apartment. You let us take everything. Just to do this? I didn't make you steal my father's life, Garnet," I said, my voice low, dropping into the quiet room like stone in a well. "I didn't make you forge his signature on the power of attorney. I didn't make you cut his medicine to speed up the probate. You did all of that because you couldn't stand the thought of leaving a single penny on the table. I just gave you a bigger table." Special Agent Miller picked up the damp quitclaim deed from the floor, glanced at the signatures, and slid it into a clear plastic evidence bag. He looked at me, a brief, professional nod of acknowledgement passing between us. He had the whistleblower data. He had the encryption keys I had delivered to his office at dawn. My $4 million would remain frozen in the escrow account as a corporate asset of Aegis, meaning it would be seized by the federal government to satisfy their $15 million tax fraud penalty. My money was gone, but so was their freedom. It was a perfect zero-sum liquidation. "Let's go," Miller said. The troopers hauled them out. Barrett was sobbing now, his expensive Tom Ford suit dragging against the doorframe as they pulled him into the corridor toward the service elevators. Garnet walked with her head down, her bare wrists cuffed behind her back, the fur coat trailing on the ground like a garbage bag. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. I turned back to the desk. Ephraim Harrison was still sitting there. The old gatekeeper of New York's elite wealth looked smaller now. The gold-rimmed spectacles sat on his blotter next to his open fountain pen. For 30 years this man had watched families bleed each other dry, always taking his cut, always ensuring the wealthiest monster won the day. Slowly Harrison stood up. He didn't reach for his briefcase. He didn't adjust his cuffs. He walked around the perimeter of the massive mahogany desk, his leather soles completely silent against the wood floor. He stopped exactly 3 feet from where I stood. He looked at my cheap black dress, my bodega notebook, and the calm, unblinking clarity in my eyes. Then the most expensive estate lawyer in Manhattan placed his hands flat against his thighs, bent his back and bowed. It wasn't a polite nod. It was a formal old-world 90-degree tilt from the waist. He held it for 3 full seconds. The air in the room seemed to freeze. When he finally straightened up, his face was filled with a cold, professional reverence that bordered on terror. "In 32 years of practice, Miss Vance," Harrison said, his rasp barely above a whisper, "I have seen men ruined by greed, by women, by war, and by the market. But I have never, not once, seen a corporate entity used to execute a family execution with such flawless mathematical precision. You didn't leave them a single exit." "They didn't leave my father an exit, Ephraim," I said. I closed my plastic-bound notebook, slid the yellow pencil into my bag, and zipped it shut. The click of the vinyl zipper was the final note of the symphony. "The estate is settled," I said. I walked past him, my heels steady against the floor, and opened the door. I walked out into the executive lobby, past the staring secretaries, and took the elevator down to the street. When I stepped out onto Lexington Avenue, the sleet was stopping. The wind was cold, sharp, and smelled of winter asphalt and wet stone. I pulled my $70 coat tight around my shoulders and looked up at the gray sky. For the first time in 6 months I could breathe. The numbers were balanced. The ledger was clean. If you want to see how the rest of the Vance family assets were dismantled piece by piece in the federal courts, drop a comment below with your thoughts on Maren's strategy. And subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of Smart Justice.